extra. Diane, let's bring you back. And the subject is back on the story of those elusive chemtrails, but also you've got some interesting comment about what the BBC has and has not done.
Yes, thanks, Brian. So going back to earlier in the show when we were talking about BBC being a trusted information source or whatever their phrase was, I want to talk about that because I did a little bit of digging based on some things that some viewers have sent me. So I know recently a lot of viewers have been in contact with me because I've been doing some reporting recently on geoengineering and chemtrails and contrails and where the research funding is going. Again, always using primary sources, not just sensationalist channels, but I'm actually trying to get to the bottom of what they are at least telling us they're doing. So some things that I got, for example, from some viewers in the past few days are some communication with their MPs. So one was back from 2014. A viewer sent this to me when this viewer was asking about chemtrails and contrails and what's actually going on in the skies. And this is directly from the letter that was sent to me, where they define chemtrails, and this is contrails. And we said, well, there's no such thing as chemtrails, essentially. But they also said, well, there are contrails, which are from aircraft that are additional water vapor, essentially, has been released by burning fuel and the mixing process, depending on the engine exhaust characteristics, which creates a plume of air. We'll come back to plumes later in this segment. And then it goes on to the next page, and it also says a little bit more about that, about what the contrails do, trying to give some sort of scientific so-called explanation about how contrails actually work. And it also talks about climate change. And one of the things that I've been seeing quite a bit is that they don't really care that much about what the content of the contrails are, which everyone knows they do exist, but what is actually being released into the atmosphere. It's more about the climate change agenda rather than what actually might be happening to human health, to people who are sensitive to these chemicals that are being released. Now, another MP that wrote to another viewer that was sent to us last week talked about contrails from aircraft, asking questions about what that meant and some back and forth. So he said that he understands that some countries have used weather modification techniques such as cloud seeding, which I reported on that recently. That says the UK does not use cloud seeding or deploy geoengineering, and then some more back and forth between the two. And the MP wrote back and said, I thought this article provided a God summary of the issues. So that was a typo. It should have said good summary, but it said God summary, which is maybe a Freudian slip. I don't know. So I looked at that article because it linked to this BBC website. And the BBC website was called Why Do Contrails Appear in the Sky? So this is from 2022. This is by a woman called Jocelyn Temperley, who is a reporter for BBC Future Planet. And she said, contrails have become an increasingly common sight. Their eye-catching presence has caught the attention of many, including through the surprisingly common belief in the chemtrails conspiracy theory. More on this later. However, it's actually their climate impact that scientists are concerned about. So again, not about human health, but the climate. So what actually are they, and should we be paying them more attention? Now, within that quote, there were two links to two academic papers. And so I followed those links to see what those papers said. And what was really interesting were what linked from those papers. So the articles that they cited, for example, the first one that I will talk about is the one about the conspiracy theorists that she mentioned. The paper is called Solar Engineering and the Chemtrails Conspiracy on Social Media. Now, this paper is very interesting in its own right. I'm not going to go into it, but it will be in the show notes if you want to read the full paper. Basically, it said that there was a 1999 online post by someone called William Thomas, which was called Contrails Poison from the Sky. And he was asking the question, what is in the contrails making people sick? Is it just water vapor or is it more? And they claimed in this academic article that it was the first to link the so-called spraying in the skies to the white lines that we see following planes. The citations were interesting within the William Thomas article. So it mentioned a U.S. Air Force report from 1996, which this article was apparently written within the U.S. Air Force, but it was apparently done as an academic exercise. There's a disclaimer saying that the views expressed in the report are those of the authors and do not reflect the official policy or position of the Air Force, Department of Defense, or the U.S. government. Now, whether or not that's the case, who knows? But it went on to say in this report that weather modification will likely become a part of national security policy with both domestic and international applications. A government will pursue such a policy depending on its interests at various levels. These levels could include unilateral actions, participation in a security framework such as NATO, membership in international organizations such as the UN, or participation in a coalition. And then it says the paper was about what the weather modification will look like in 2025, which is a really good time to be talking about this, because then it said, assuming that in 2025, our national security strategy includes weather modification, its use in our national military strategy will naturally follow. Besides the significant benefits and operational capability would provide, another motivation to pursue weather modification is to deter and counter political adversaries. Now, this was written in 1996, 1997, so this is what they were talking about would be happening now. The article I mentioned earlier also mentioned HAARP, which is the Organization of the States, and HAARP's website says that no, they cannot create chemtrails. They do talk about contrails that form behind aircraft, and they basically just say on their website that it is essentially condensation from the exhaust of jet engines. It doesn't say anything about the chemicals that are being released. Now, it also mentions a book which you can read for free on the Internet Archive called Weather and Climate Modification. This was an academic research government publication published by John Wiley, which is a reputable publisher in academia. The editor was called W. N. Hess. He is of the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration Environmental Research Laboratories, which was published in 1972. Within the preface, it said there is a 28-year history, remember this is 1972, of weather modification now since the revolutionary dry ice seeding experiments were conducted by Vincent Schaefer and Irving Langmuir at General Electric. There was a major upswing in the late 1940s and early 1950s after Schaefer's discovery that dry ice would produce snow in a box filled with supercooled water drops. This was called Project Cirrus. This was in 1947, was the first one. There was an article that was published in 2017 by the U.S. Department of Commerce discussing the 70th anniversary of the first hurricane seeding experiment, which is what this was, by the U.S. Navy. Also in this book, it asked 8 questions that were meant to be kind of setting out a research agenda for the next few years. And these questions were, is there a significant downwind effect from cloud seeding? Can we effectively clear warm fogs? Can cloud seeding produce severe weather like tornadoes? Remember, this is an American publication. We don't really have those here in the UK. Can we increase participation from winter storms? Can we decrease hail and lightning in thunderstorms? Can we steer hurricanes by seeding them? Can we decrease rainfall under some seeding conditions? Is it possible to understand long-term climatic changes now? So also in 1972, there was an experiment called Project Stormfury, where they actually seeded a hurricane. Let's take a look at this from the AP archive and see what they said.
The seeding planes fly across the eye and into these clouds, seeding the supercooled, the sharp pressure differences in the heart of the hurricane, which produce the strongest winds in the storm. Flying a series of intricate patterns into the seeded clouds, the monitoring planes measure any changes in wind velocities and pressure caused by the seeding of the greatest storm on Earth.
Now, also in that time period, we had between 1969 and 1972, there was Operation Popeye, which was a government operation to prolong the monsoon season in Vietnam during the war, using what they called known cloud seeding techniques. And this information was released. It was originally a hearing in the U.S. Senate, which was top secret at first, but it's now released and it's freely available online, where it said that this rainmaking program was conducted from, as I said, 1967 to 1972, which employed airdropped silver and lead iodide seeding units to increase normal monsoon rainfall. But what's interesting about that is that in 1976, so 4 years later, there was a UN paperwork written up called the Convention on the Prohibition of Military or Any Other Hostile Use of Environmental Modification Techniques. This happened, of course, after this particular operation in Vietnam, and who knows what else happened. We don't really know yet. But what this said was that they were convinced that the convention should not affect the use of environmental modification techniques for peaceful purposes, which could contribute to the preservation and improvement of the environment for the benefit of present and future generations. So that's saying there, okay, so we're not going to use it in warfare, but if it's going to so-called save the planet, then maybe we should do it. The other paper, which I won't go into detail, but I just want to mention to close this out, was called The Contribution of Global Aviation to Anthropogenic Climate Forcing for 2000 to 2018. This was the second paper that was linked that I mentioned from the BBC article. And it had this little graphic here, which made me wonder about the questions of what is in the contrails, because it says here all of these different things that are in the plume composition. So this is researchers that are talking about how this is actually working through global aviation measures. And it lists a lot of things, including others. So what is the others? And why are they so worried about what plane flights do to so-called climate change, that we can promote that agenda, but not the health of those of us who are breathing the air that are being released by these particular particles? So I'm just asking a question, Brian and Ben. I don't know what you think, but I'm a bit concerned.
I think you're absolutely right to be concerned, Diane. I think we've got to an interesting stage where information about this subject is coming to the surface. And of course, it's now becoming easier to dig into it. But we've got to come back to this key question: is what is taking place as we witness every specific event? So is this happening across aviation fuel that's used by every single aircraft? Is this one problem in much the same ways that we had a pollution problem when cars were using leaded fuel? So have we got to change to aviation fuel, or is aviation fuel being used selectively in order to get some other agenda with regard to whatever it may be, cloud seeding or any other weather modification experience happening? When we see a trail in the sky, it's still difficult to say exactly what that aircraft is doing. And this is the key point. And of course, the BBC demonstrating there once again that they are only going to go so far into this subject. And if you delve in too far, they're going to brand you a conspiracy theorist. So I think the good news out of this topic at the moment is that it is beginning to break surface. And yes, we can be delving into it in order to get more evidence as to what is actually taking place. Letters, questions to your MP, to the BBC, to scientific bodies, of course, also make a difference.